And hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Happy Juneteenth, in fact. And welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is called the Erickson Report. And we start this time with an observation, one I think that we'll mostly agree on. The United States has a gun problem. It really can't be denied that we have a gun problem. But part of the problem that isn't talked about that much, but is still significant, is that we actually don't know how many guns there are in this country or how many people have them. Because keeping official records on that sort of thing, thanks to the standard combination of the NRA and political cowardice, because of that, keeping track on those kind of things is essentially illegal. So the information we have is all by survey. But according to one of the most highly respected such surveys, this is the Switzerland-based Small Arms Survey, which does this about countries around the world on a yearly basis. According to them, there are about 120 guns for every 100 Americans. There are more guns than there are people. We are the only country in the world where that is true. In fact, the second most, if you will, gun-intensive country, which is Yemen, has about 60-something guns per 100 people, and they're in a 7-year civil war. Americans own nearly half of the privately held guns in the entire world. Now, those numbers, of course, they're by survey, so they're a little bit uncertain, a little bit of variation in them. But there is one thing we know for sure. More guns equals more gun crime, more gun deaths, more murders, more suicides. That's what the research shows over and over and over again. So much so that on a national level, on a country level, there is pretty much a straight line relationship between the percentage of people who own guns and the rate of gun death. On this graph here, that red dot in the upper right corner, that's us. We are clearly an outlier in this. And it's true within our nation as well. According to Scientific American, there are about 30 studies that show that more guns in an area are linked to more crimes of all sorts, not just homicide, but gun crimes involving murders, rapes, armed robbery, and other such. And in fact, the number of studies indicating that's not true, they said there's only a handful of those. In other words, more guns do not stop crime, they create it. Again, according to Scientific American, assaults with a firearm are nearly 7 times more likely in states that had the most guns compared to the states that had the fewest. More than a dozen studies have revealed that if you have a gun at home, you are more likely to be killed by a gun than someone who didn't have a gun. In fact, twice as likely. Research from the Harvard School of Public Health says that states with higher gun ownership have higher rates of homicide. Data even tells us that if gun shops or gun dealers open in an area, killings in those neighborhoods goes up. The group everytownresearch.org compared gun policy in states across the country, examining the strength of their gun laws and comparing those to the rate of gun crime in that state. And overall, the states with the stronger gun laws had lower rates of gun violence. Gun control saves lives. But instead of facing those facts, instead of acting on the basis of those facts, we have this. Over the past 5 years, on average, over 15,000 people have been killed by guns, murdered by guns in the United States every year. Over the past 5 years, on average, nearly 24,000 people have committed suicide by gun every year. All told, it's about over 40,000 deaths by gun a year, every year. That's 110 people a day. That's 4 Uvaldes plus 3 Buffaloes a day, every day, day after day. It's to the point where firearms are now the leading cause of death for American children and teenagers. The U.S. gun homicide rate is 26 times that of other high-income countries, and access to a gun doubles the risk of homicide. In fact, for 15 to 24-year-olds, the gun death rate in the United States, the gun homicide rate in the United States, is 49 times that of other high-income countries. The U.S. gun suicide rate is 12 times higher than other high-income countries, and access to a gun triples the risk of death by suicide, and gun suicides in the U.S. are concentrated in the states where there are the most guns. The weight of evidence is overwhelming. Guns produce crime, guns produce violence, guns produce death. And they produce mass shootings, in fact. As of June 12th, since Uvalde, mass shootings here are defined as at least 4 people shot in a single incident, okay? Since Uvalde, there have been 54 mass shootings in the United States, resulting in 62 dead, 231 injured. However, despite all that, according to a recent poll, 44% of Republicans hold that even if all that's true, well, you know, it's unfortunate, it's terrible, it's sad, but it's something we have to accept to live in a free society. It's the price we pay for freedom. The freedom we're guaranteed by the Second Amendment, the amendment that itself is the one that guarantees our freedom. You know, that's bull. I'm going to have to get a little legalistic on you, but it's necessary because you can be damn sure that whenever this comes up, the gun nuts tried out the same thing. Second Amendment, I can have my guns, Constitution says so. So first, let's be clear on what the Second Amendment actually says. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's it. That's the whole thing. There were some relatively early cases before the Supreme Court about the extent, the reach, the understanding of this amendment. But they were before the Second Amendment was incorporated. That is, before it was established that the promises of the Second Amendment, the limits apply to the states as well as to the federal government. So the first big relevant case on this was United States v. Miller. That was in 1939, and it concerned the National Firearms Act of 1934. That act required certain types of weapons, most specifically machine guns and sawed-off shotguns, to be registered and taxed. A unanimous Supreme Court upheld the law, finding there was no conflict with the Second Amendment. In fact, the court found, and I'm quoting the decision here, in the absence of any evidence tending to show that the possession or use of a weapon of the sort that was actually involved in the case, possession or use of such a weapon has some reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia, we cannot say that the Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear such an instrument. With the obvious purpose to assure the continuation and render possible the effectiveness of such forces, the declaration and guarantee of the Second Amendment were made. It must be interpreted and applied with that end in view. Now, the language there is kind of stilted, but the meaning is clear enough. For 69 years, that was the legal precedent. It was relied on by all lower courts, referred to by the Supreme Court itself. For 69 years, the legal standard was that states and the federal government have the right to regulate, the legitimate power to regulate weapons that were not related to maintaining a well-regulated militia, which in the absence of state militias, except to the extent the National Guard could be regarded as such, pretty much meant any weapon at all. Put another way, the guarantee of the Second Amendment was understood to describe not an individual right, but a collective one. It applied to the people as a whole, not to discrete individuals, and referred to the right of the people of a state or a nation to collectively defend themselves against attack. After 69 years, the narrowest possible majority of the Supreme Court, 5-4, decided to ignore those decades of precedent, or more properly, to simply regard them as entirely irrelevant. In 2008, in District of Columbia v. Heller, the court ruled for the first time in U.S. history that the Second Amendment provides an individual right to own a gun. To do that, they had to go through some real mental contortions. They treated the reference to a militia as merely prefatory. That is, it's just a reference that had no legal effect, no legal meaning, even though there doesn't seem to be another case of such a prefatory statement anywhere in the Constitution. And what's more, the phrase keep and bear arms has traditionally referred to serving in a military, including a militia. To get around that, the court majority broke that phrase into two separate pieces. So it's not a right to keep and bear arms. It is a right to keep arms and an entirely separate right to bear arms. Which, of course, that means that these justices had to ignore that the text, they're so concerned with original meaning, so concerned with the plain text of the law and so on, but they had to ignore that the text says the right, singular, to keep and bear arms, not the rights to keep and bear arms, not the right to keep and the right to bear arms, but the right, singular, to keep and bear arms. To put it bluntly, this right of an individual to own a gun, they made it up out of nothing. They completely made it up. In fact, Justice John Paul Stevens, in his, who was one of the dissenters, later called it the most wrongly decided decision in his entire time on the court. Now, Heller only applied to federal enclaves such as the District of Columbia, but 2 years later in McDonald v. Chicago, the court ruled, again 5-4, that this applied to the states as well. All right, this is what the gun nuts now rely on. This is what they now argue. I can't have gun control, Second Amendment, Supreme Court's rule, debate's over. Now, first off, if you're ever faced with that argument, the first thing you should do is ask the wacko in question if at any time during the 69 years that the court said otherwise, during those 69 years of that being established precedent, did they or anybody else at any point during that time say, well, I guess debate's over, court ruled, we lost. Now, of course, they didn't. So they can't well expect us to do it now. Especially because I'm going to advance an argument that the interpretation of the Second Amendment used by the reactionary Supreme Court and the gun nuts and the NRA is wholly bogus, even beyond the court's contortions in Heller and McDonald. First, again, here's the text. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, here is James Madison's original proposed text. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, a well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country. But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person. Now, note that expressed that way, the tying of the article to a militia is clear and undeniable. It makes no sense to regard the reference to militia as just, a passing comment with no meaning for the rest of the item. What's more, the powers of Congress, as listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, include these, among others, but it includes these. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. To provide and maintain a navy. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. And to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. Note well, Congress here can maintain a navy, but can only raise an army, and that for only a period of 2 years at a time. And meanwhile, it can call out the militia to suppress insurrections and repel invasions. The expectation was that the United States would not have a standing army, but that one would be raised in the event of need. And meanwhile, the militias would be the first line of defense against an attack. Despite that, and this is something that John Paul Stevens pointed out in his dissent in Heller, there was still a concern at the time that Congress would form a national standing army and disband the state militias. The Second Amendment was intended as a guarantee to states that their militias could be maintained. So remember at this time, we are not a union. We're not a nation, we're a confederation of states. And each state was concerned with maintaining its own status and with providing for its own defense, including potentially against other states. And in fact, the issue of militias came up in several of the constitutional conventions in those states, deciding whether or not they were going to ratify the Constitution. And in fact, it specifically, notoriously came up in Virginia, where it was for an overtly racist concern of being able to maintain their so-called white patrols, which were basically designed to keep the slaves in line. Which means that, yes, in any point, the Second Amendment was about a militia from the very beginning, which means Miller decision got it right, and the Heller decision should go to hell. But there's another thing equally important. The gun nuts actually don't know what Heller and McDonald decision said. In fact, in Heller McDonald, the court said it agreed with the Miller decision that the government has the right to regulate weapons. And that it only applies to weapons in common use for lawful purposes. In fact, the court said it should not, specifically said that the Heller decision should not cast doubt on long-standing prohibitions against things like possession of firearms by felons or carrying firearms into government buildings or imposing qualifications on the sale of arms. It also said that other existing or potential prohibitions, such as banning concealed weapons or the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons, were unaffected by this decision. So the gun nuts who claim the Second Amendment gives them the right pretty much to get any weapon they want, carry it anywhere they want, anytime they want, they're completely wrong. Because, in fact, under current jurisprudence, carrying concealed guns can be banned. Carrying guns into schools, government buildings, and such can be banned. Assault weapons can be banned. Semi-automatic handguns can be banned. High-capacity magazines can be banned. Bump stocks can be banned. Safety locks can be required. Dangerous and unusual weaponry, such as hollow-point bullets and armor-piercing rounds, can all be banned. And even in the wake of Heller and McDonald, courts usually upheld gun rules, finding that, yes, individuals have a right to a gun, but society has a right to protect itself. And in fact, that society agrees. In a recent Ipsos poll, 70% of respondents say enacting gun control laws are more important than protecting the rights of people to own a variety of guns. A recent CBS News poll found 54% of Americans want laws covering the sale of guns to be made stricter. Pew Research last year covered a whole bunch of issues relating to guns, and they found public support. 63% supporting banning assault weapons, 64% supporting banning high-capacity magazines, 70% in favor of police-initiated red flag laws, 77% in favor of family-initiated red flag laws, 79% said they oppose being able to carry a concealed weapon without a special permit, 81% supported universal background checks. And Political Morning Consult poll more recently gave backing to some of those results, finding that 2/3 support a ban on assault rifles, and 84% of voters, including 77% of Republicans and a majority of gun owners, support universal background checks. And in terms of societal support for its right to self-protection, it's wise to recall here that gun ownership is actually a distinctly minority position. Based on most recent surveys, about 32% of Americans over 18 actually own a gun. And the figure may be lower, and only 40 to 42% of the population lives in a house where anybody owns a gun. The Rand Corporation, meanwhile, has noted that the level of the percentage of houses where somebody owns a gun has actually declined since 1990. Which means that figure I referenced, about 120 guns for every 100 Americans, about half of all gun owners own just one or two guns. 8% of gun owners, that is just 3% of the entire population, own half of all the guns in this country. It is clearly a minority position to own a gun, which makes the political cowardice involved even more offensive, even more remarkable. It makes the moral offensiveness even more notable. Now, admittedly, the House of Representatives has recently tried to take some steps, knowing surely that was a futile gesture, but they tried at least. The House had recently passed a package of bills that would raise the minimum age for buying a semi-automatic rifle to 21, ban high-capacity magazines, crack down on gun trafficking, create safe storage rules for home storage, and codify executive orders that banned ghost guns and bump stocks. And it had already earlier passed legislation calling for universal background checks. However, you'll notice that there's something missing from that list. Something missing from that list. It avoided the issue of a ban on assault weapons. Did not ban them, did not propose banning them. It's completely off the table. It's totally. The idea of banning assault rifles rather, is off the table even as the House passes all this other stuff. This is despite the clear relation to saving lives that's involved here, because there was such a ban in effect in the United States for 10 years, from 1994 to 2004. And it correlated with a significant reduction in mass deaths, mass shooting deaths. For the 10 years preceding this ban, there were about 65 mass shootings using these kind of guns in that 10-year period. During the 10 years of the ban, there were 55 or so, which is a rather significant drop, which some people, however, deny was really a statistically significant difference. What they can't deny, however, is that in the 10 years after the ban was lifted, the number of such shootings rose to 181. But it's so far off the table that not only isn't it part of the House legislation, in fact, the Senate said, and before they even brought anything about guns up, they said, well, that's not going to happen. It was off the table before it started. But the Senate, what they have now in this major bipartisan breakthrough, this breaking the log jams that we're getting, they have a framework. Not legislation, not even a finished piece of legislation to debate. They have a framework for the legislation, which turns out now to be an almost finished framework for the legislation. The big elements in this framework are encouraging, not requiring, but encouraging states to establish red flag laws, providing money for school safety, money for some mental health resources, and expanding background checks for buyers under 21. Now, all this, I suppose, is better than nothing, even though that's a really damn low bar to have to get over. But it is so far removed from what's needed that it almost feels like yet another defeat, like another surrender on the part of those who at least should know better. Especially because the school safety stuff is not only crap, it's potentially dangerous. A 2021 study from Hamline University and the Metropolitan State University looked at mass school shootings over a 40-year period, 1980 to 2019. And after controlling for factors including the school location and the characteristics of the school, they found that the death rate was nearly 3 times higher in cases where there was an armed guard present. And because if I understand the argument that what the findings correctly, it's that in cases where there was an armed guard, the shooter still went into the school, but knowing there was an armed guard, they just started shooting as many people as they could, as fast as they could. And mental health, this one really gets me. The best and most recent and most reliable research says that there is no reliable predictive value in associating a history of mental health with gun violence. Put clearly, the research says that people with mental illness are no more likely to commit violence, especially mass violence, than anybody else is. We simply can't dismiss the harsh truth of mass violence with the slogan, better mental health programs. In fact, if somebody raises that issue with you, that it's all about mental health, because since these kind of things don't seem to happen in other countries, why don't you ask them, what is it about living in the United States that drives people nuts? What is it so bad here that people go crazy in a way they don't go in other countries? Now, mental health programs, yes, absolutely. They are justified, but they're justified on their own account, not because they will deal with gun violence, because they will not. They're a gun lobby, gun industry, right-wing, gun fanatic generated distraction, trying to get us to look at anything except the damn guns. Don't get distracted. Stay focused, especially because right now it appears the Supreme Court is on the verge of making this whole business worse. The case is State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Brune. It's a challenge to a New York state law that's been in effect since 1913 that says that anybody who wants to carry a concealed weapon in public has to get a special permit explaining why they need one. The suit claims the Second Amendment allows them to do that without providing any reason whatsoever. Don't need a permit, they can just do it. Based on oral argument, it appears that the super-reactionary supermajority of that court is going to agree with that. dramatically expanding the scope of the Second Amendment and further increasing the presence and therefore the risk and therefore the damage done by guns, all the while ignoring its own dicta in Heller that such laws are unaffected by that decision. Such a decision, in fact, is going to reverberate far beyond New York. 7 other states, including California, Connecticut, Delaware, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, plus Washington, D.C. and several other big cities, have the same such laws, all of which we put at instant risk by a decision. And I think it's one of the bases for the argument that getting a permit is that getting a permit requires the permission of some local authority, usually a chief of police, and that these people say it violates the Second Amendment, that some government agent can decide this. If in striking down the law, as it's expected to do, the super-reactionary supermajority accepts that part of the argument, if in striking down the law it does that, it would set a standard that would positively invite challenges to a wide variety of other gun control and safety regulations, because it's hard to imagine any such regulation or law which does not at some point involve a government agent, a government official, deciding whether or not you can get a certain gun. Now, there is some speculation that the reason the court has not already announced the decision is that they are waiting for a more politically convenient time than shortly after 2 major mass shootings. The interesting question is whether or not they will ever be able to find such a convenient time. But the thing is here, I want to end up with this. We have to stay focused. We can't get distracted, because the fact is nobody's going to do this for us. This is only going to happen if we press. It's only going to happen if we demand. It's only going to happen if we say there is a political price for you to be paid if you do not act on this. And you want my personal opinion? I mean, you know, nobody's talking because we can't talk about getting rid of guns, period. But the fact is, you want to go hunting? Use a basic hunting rifle. I mean, you know, just use a hunting rifle. I mean, you know, there's no need to pump 15 quick slugs into a deer. In fact, why don't you go hunting with a bow? Or is the difficulty of tracking a deer long enough to get close enough to be sure of taking it down with a bow just that much easier than shooting it down from a couple of 100 yards away with your manhood? You want to go target shooting? Use a pellet gun. Yeah, I know they can be dangerous, blah, blah, blah. But don't tell me that you need a Glock to shoot holes in a paper target. Now, let's just be, in my opinion, just, you know, all these things that can be banned, frankly, they should be. They should be. In fact, let's go beyond that. We should go beyond that. When the people who oppose women's rights, the people who say that, you know, that they're against allowing for the right of abortion, those people did not just say after the Roe decision that, oh, well, it's over. They just kept saying that was wrong, that was wrong, that was wrong, that was wrong. We should be saying Heller was wrong, was wrong, was wrong, was wrong. And the last thing, is that Bill Press, a syndicated columnist journalist, just said it out loud, one of the few people that have. It's time to think about this too. We should be saying, get rid of the Second Amendment entirely. If we're going to have one, we should have one for the 21st century, not for the 17th, not for the 18th. All right? That's it. Anyway, I'm done. I'm out of here. We will see you in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.